Okay, so good morning everyone and welcome to this Thursday's Let's Talk Dairy. As I said, I'm going to try and keep these as brief as I can at the moment because I'm conscious that people are busy, and it's great that you're still able to tune in, given the time of year and so forth. So I suppose it's good in that sense. I'm going to cover something today that probably don't tend to put a lot of emphasis on at this stage of the year in general in the normal course of events. So I think it's worth taking advantage of the opportunity to do it today, and that's body condition score management in the springtime. Now, we will talk about it generally quite commonly around the breeding season in particular, and we already did cover it in terms of cows being dried off and so forth with John Paul Murphy, the farm manager in Moore Park, and John McCabe a couple of about 2-3 months ago now at this stage from the farm in Moore Park at the time. And the situation is, I suppose, like the body condition management is an ongoing thing throughout the year. And the way we do it is it's important when it's done. So when is it done? It should ideally be done in or around kind of from now on through to the breeding season. And I suppose the reason I'm talking about it today is I think that there's quite clearly very low level of grazing done in a lot of cases across the country because of the weather conditions that have been there for February. We talk a lot about quality silage, but in reality, the quality of silage that's available for milking cows come the springtime, because of logistics within yards, can be not exactly where we want it to be, and maybe cows might be under a little bit of pressure, and especially cows that have had incidences or upsets. And like Joe would have spoken about it there in the last couple of weeks as well in terms of feed space, and some people are under pressure in terms of feed space, and that puts freshly calved cows under pressure as well. So it's probably timely, given that we're nearly at the 1st of March, and come the 1st of April, we're going to be talking about looking at cows and making sure that they're fit for breeding and so forth. So we're just going to talk about it very briefly today in relation to what you can do maybe early on. I think the sooner the better, really, in terms of trying to correct any issues around body condition score. So you could have a situation of cows that have calved down in the lower body condition score than you would have intended, or you have cows that have calved down in a high body condition score, which is quite common actually, and has given rise to a share of milk fever problems maybe, as well as high case silage and so forth. So as a result of that, the body condition loss can be a little bit extreme in some cases, and actions have to be taken in order to correct that. So I'm just going to share a couple of slides here with you. So just to bring you back to kind of first principles in relation to body condition score, obviously our objective is to calve cows down in that 3 to 3.25 window. There will be a proportion of the herd going to be pushing towards the 3.5, depending on when they're dried off, depending on cow type, those kind of things. Ideally, they want to be at 3.25. And if we go back to our 3 at the very minimum, if we go back maybe 20 odd years probably at this stage, Frank Buckley did an extensive amount of work in relation to body condition score and its impact on subsequent herd fertility. And Frank's work would show that if we can minimize the loss of condition or the loss of weight to less than half a condition score, then the chances of cows going in calf are dramatically improved as a result of not having lost excess body weight. The unfortunate situation is, of course, that we have this kind of a scenario in relation to how cows respond when they calve. So cows calve, their peak milk comes well before their peak intake, and as a result they can lose a lot of condition. Now, EBI has been very, very successful in terms of helping us to breed cows that still milk. I must emphasize that these cows can still milk, but they're just inclined to be more better to hold their condition than the cows that were under the old RBI system, would say, which would have been cows that would have been around when this graph was done in 1983. But this graph still holds true currently, and you can, when you look here, you see that cows will be hitting maybe 30 to 35 litres potentially, and their feed intake is running a couple of weeks behind. So their peak in lactation is coming at the 4 to 6 week period. So in some cases, there are cows just on the cusp of hitting their peak, and obviously those that will have calved slightly later are going to be at the point of hitting it maybe early mid-March. Then those calving around now are going to be starting to hit into it at the start of April or mid-April. But our dry matter intake then is not peaking until 9 to 11 weeks into the calved period or the post-calving period. So as a result, we have to try and just be careful. I suppose there's some cows naturally programmed to produce more milk, and they are going to milk off their back. And as I said, EBI has kind of mitigated against that to a certain extent, so it's probably not as wholesale as it would have been in the past. So I suppose what I'm really focusing on here maybe are cows that for one reason or another, as I said already, be it feed space maybe, or something going wrong, so a milk fever, case of milk fever, or maybe a lameness incidence or something like that, that has impacted on their intake further than their intake is already reduced during that early post-calving period, just because they can't take enough in. So I suppose just to put it into context, your freshly calved cow has an ability to take in 10 kilos of dry matter, and that increases by about a kilo a week, or thereabouts, for the next 6 to 8 weeks, up to maximum of your 18, 19 kilos. Your heifer then, on the other hand, first calver, is back at 8 kilos and then trying to increase at about a half a kilo a week, up to kind of a maximum of kind of 15 to 16. So they wouldn't have the same intake potential as the milking cow anyway. But they're running a little bit slower as well. And then there's also issues if you're tight on feed space, heifers are probably going to be the ones that are going to suffer, because they're going to lose out in the pecking order within the herd. So what we're trying to do is still have a good milk production profile without impacting on our energy status too much, which compromises our breeding performance subsequently. So as I said, Frank's research would have shown quite significantly the impact of managing body condition score, and EBI has helped us as farmers in Ireland to mitigate against a share of that issue that would have been there when Frank would have done his studies originally, because the cows that Frank would have been looking at were very much programmed to produce milk in terms of volume of litres, which is predominantly water-based rather than solids-based, which the cows that we are dealing with now currently are more inclined to produce. So the feed energy intake is less than the energy output for milk production, and that results in negative energy balance. How long that lasts or how long it persists is going to be important in terms of the effect that it's going to have subsequently in terms of reproductive performance. And if we can minimize that by feeding cows well and making sure that they're managed well, we're going to have a successful enough breeding period as a result of it. Now that would tie in, I suppose, a small bit then as well, just to come back to what Donald Patton would have said 2 weeks ago, I think it was. Donald was on with us, just in relation to not having to be feeding silage in that April period as we're moving out into this 90 to 100 day, just kind of a gone past the peak, but wanting to drive on in terms of energy reserves within the body and the rising plane and nutrition that Dorian Corridan talks about always. And the important thing here is that we can try and manage to have high quality forage in front of cows, and the best quality forage that we can manage to have there is going to be grazed grass, ideally. Even with the best quality silage, you're going to struggle to produce the energy required along with the best quality of ration that you can feed compared to a grass and ration situation. So if there is silage to win again, now hopefully we'll get going and grazing. We have a nice morning here in Cork today compared to what we've had all along, and there's a settled spell in the forecast, so hopefully we'll be able to get back grazing. And John Douglas from the Grass 10 team is going to be talking to us next week, maybe, or the week after, in relation to grass management now and how it's changed as a result of the wet start to the year. For a lot of people, there won't be a huge proportion of people have hit the target of 30% graze for the end of February, given the February that we've had, particularly in the southwest region of the country anyway. So we're trying to minimize that energy loss or that body condition score loss, and to have them primed for breeding. So what are the options that we have? As I said, we're talking about looking at the cows that have had maybe issues, or maybe cows that calve down slightly less than optimal body condition score, so less than the 3 body condition score. So there are only 2 options in reality people will consider. First one is the one that people think first, is generally to feed more to those cows. Does that work? Generally, I would suggest that it won't, because just the programming of the cow is that if you feed them more, the chances are that they're going to try and produce more milk as opposed to put the condition on their body at this stage of their lactation. Just the nature of the biology of how it works. When a cow calves, they just start to put their fat reserves into milk production, and feeding more just tends to drive on further production, which can actually exacerbate the situation that you're in. And the other thing is it's tricky in a lot of cases now. A lot of herds should be on 5 or 6 kilos meal at the moment with full-time silage maybe in some cases, and it's hard to feed anything much more than that without coming in with an additional feed later on, and that becomes very complex then to actually deliver at ground level in terms of the practicalities of feeding maybe a handful of cows within a group of cows extra feeding, to do that without upsetting them from making them an acid loading in their stomach that's going to cause problems for them and further exacerbate the situation. So in reality, we're talking about having a quick look through the cows over the next couple of days, picking out the ones that haven't fared well. So maybe, as I said, cows that have had body condition score, or sorry, milk fever issues and have reduced intake as a result of it. Also, maybe any cow that has retained a clearing that may be associated with a calcium problem, as Joe would have outlined a couple of weeks ago, but it may also just be something to do with a mineral issue, general minerals, and cows may have an infection, and that's going to impact on them. If they have a temperature, their intake is going to be impacted. If they got pneumonia, there's going to be an impact on intake as well. So they're going to be in poorer condition. So the solution for those cows is without doubt once a day. And I suppose at the moment, I would say that if people are indoors by night and are going to be continuing to be indoors for a period of time by night, time to milk those cows, Don would recommend strongly, is in the evening milking, so they're not carrying heavy bags of milk on overnight, and milk them in the morning then. And if they're in full time, that's when they should be milked, is at night time. If they're out by day, obviously they're okay to carry the milk during the day because they're going to be in a clean environment. So they should be milked to make sure that they're not on cubicles at night, carrying high levels of milk that's going to be leaking on the cubicles and obviously putting them at risk of mastitis. Is there a benefit in this? Without doubt, you're going to see an improvement of body condition when you go to once a day. It's the equivalent of feeding in or around the region of 2 kilos extra feed to them. It improves their body condition dramatically in a short enough space of time, and it also actually helps them to recover, assuming that everything else is right. So, as I said, if you had a cow with a retained clearing, if that infection hasn't been dealt with or the cow hasn't been dealt with properly there, once a day isn't going to necessarily solve that problem. But if all things being equal, once a day is going to actually probably bring forward the return to cyclicity in a cow at any stage of lactation. So we would generally talk about this quite a lot in relation to late calving cows and how you can short cycle them, I suppose, in one sense, by doing once a day later on in the season. But you can do it right now as well, as I said, with those couple of cows. There's probably a handful of them in every herd at this stage, because I don't know of any herd that probably doesn't have some issues during the spring in terms of calving. So hard calvings can also impact on cows as well. Is there a benefit, as I said already, from a financial point of view? It's hard to put a figure on it, but I would say probably that we're looking at somewhere in the region of maybe a lost production of potentially somewhere between 50 and 70 euros on the milk that you're not going to put into the tank because this cow is being milked once a day. However, the real benefit is probably in the saving of a replacement cost subsequently if these cows don't go into calf, or you'll definitely spend the 50 to 70 euro on trying to get this cow in calf subsequently if you're going to try to get her in calf and she is in poor condition. So you're kind of pushing a fairly heavy load up against the hill, basically, in terms of trying to get a cow in calf once you hit the breeding period, if they're in poor condition. So there's just that's kind of pretty much the summary of it. There's 2 questions in, and I'd encourage you to put in a few extra questions if you want to, because we'll be wrapping up quickly enough now. So Sean McCardle, is it a good idea to put heifers on once a day as standard after calving, and how long should they be kept on once a day? I suppose, Sean, in a lot of cases, people are there's a lot more people, or more and more every year, seem to be moving to once a day anyway in the month of February to deal with workload. And the general consensus would be that 4 to 6 weeks, and I probably would think that 4 weeks is probably the optimal for the entire herd. That means that you don't have a lot of cows on once a day for a very long period of time. And the other thing that I've seen in a case where I have, we've looked at it in detail with one client where he had access to labour, didn't take the option of the labour and actually went once a day, was on once a day for quite a long period of time. and it actually impacted on the overall production rather significantly, I suppose. So the situation there would be that I would say 4 weeks is probably the maximum as a standard to go once a day with heifers. I don't necessarily think it's justified unless there's some underlying issue with silage quality or something like that that you just have to. But as a standard, I wouldn't say that heifers have to go once a day, as long as they have plenty of adequate feed space and, like Joe says, have a bit of comfort in the post-calving period and get kind of assimilated into the whole milk production profile scenario quite comfortably. They should be okay and they'll survive perfectly well within the system. You shouldn't see a high drop off in heifers as a result of being milked twice a day. They don't have that major production drive, obviously. A lot of people will often say that it's the third calvers where they really start to drive on milk, and even second calvers are beginning to really produce high volumes now as well in their second lactation, that they probably are the ones that can be a bit more difficult to get back in calf rather than the first calvers. And then the next question is, how much concentrate should you feed to a cow in early lactation? Say 30 litres in good body condition on good silage. Don't think 5 to 6 kilos is enough, as she will lose condition. Yeah, I suppose there's probably an argument for that you can go to 7 kilos there, but the real problem with going in excess of that is that you're getting to a very significant loading of acid in a cow stomach in a short space of time. So the situation would be there that you could feed 5 to 6 kilos through the parlour, but if you're going with additional feed, it probably has to be fed on the silage as a separate feed, and also or maybe as a midday feed. And the consequences of that are kind of that it can be tricky to be done in some cases. In terms of the loss of condition, I think actually in hindsight now, in following on from what I said, there is work done by Mary McAvoy a couple of years ago that would show that very good production in Trials in Moore Park, where they were feeding 5 to 6 kilos, and it didn't actually impact them. There will be natural loss of condition anyway, in spite of feeding, but it's trying to minimise that loss. So Mary's trial would have shown that cows produced similar quantities to that 30 litres that you're talking about there, and actually didn't only lost about 20 kilos, being fed 5 to 6 kilos of ration with grass only. Now the silage situation, I suppose, yeah, it does complicate it, but I would like to think that we're beginning to turn the corner in terms of getting out to grass. Hopefully that the weather is going to settle down for the month of March and that we'll be able to move on from there. And I wouldn't like to generally be feeding much more than 5 to 6 kilos with grass in the diet as well, even if there is silage in the diet at that stage. And the same person's asking, cows haven't been out to grass yet this year, should you be worried? I wouldn't think so. As long as they've had that 70 DMD silage and a good level of ration being fed to them there all along, they should be in good order. Cows are milking well, as far as I can gather from people, talking to people. And they're just going to begin to drive on from there. So sorry about that now. So I wouldn't be worried about them from that point of view. I think they should be okay. So would you keep problem cows on once a day until they show signs of heat? I think you probably would. At this stage of the lactation, I think that's probably the objective, is to just make sure that they do actually show heat. Later on in the lactation, and George and I have been talking about this, and maybe Stephen Butler and Stephen Moore might come in at some stage and talk to us about it as well. I actually feel that once a day for late calving cows should actually be practiced beyond when they show heat. They should be served and possibly kept on once a day until they actually go beyond their 3 weeks for the first serve, in order to hold the conception. I think the idea that you'll carry them to the point of being served and then switch them back to twice a day doesn't work in my head in terms of what you've been trying to achieve. So if you've been on once a day to get them cycling, obviously you want them to breed, or you've done that because you want to retain them in the herd. And if you don't go that extra step, I think in terms of leaving them on that lower plane of demand in terms of milk production until they actually show that don't show again, basically, so they don't return, I think you're probably again wasting your time almost to a certain extent. But I would say from the point of view of going on once a day right now, that there would be, if cow shows heat then within the next couple of weeks and condition has corrected, that they're probably okay to go back twice a day at that stage, because the time frame is just greater. Whereas with those late calving cows, you don't have the time to play with. So then another question in, Matthew Walsh, would you recommend putting late calvers on once a day to improve chances of getting back? And so I've addressed that there as well. So yes, definitely, I strongly recommend that any cow that you want to retain in your herd, put them on once a day. And my thinking, as I said, we'll have to discuss it with Stephen Moore and Stephen Butler to see their thoughts, is that they should be kept on it until they are actually more or less, I won't say confirmed in calf, but the fact that they haven't repeated, we'll take it and we'll make the assumption that they are actually in calf at that stage, and then they can go back on. So if cows on 30 litres need up to 9 kgs, will rumen buffs and yeast not combat the dangers of acidosis? So yeasts won't have much to do for you in terms of combating acidosis. The rumen buffers can play a role. 9 kilos is a fairly heavy feeding rate, I suppose. The one thing I'd caution about there, I suppose, is when you look at, and Joe would have done work on it in relation to the Johnstown herd in the past, is that not every cow in the herd is going to be doing 30 litres necessarily. So maybe feeding those cows that are producing potentially, but again, it's complicated unless you have a system to do it. Rumen buffers definitely will, I suppose the advantage that they have over the likes of the sodium bicarbonate is that they go in at a lower rate, so that they're not maybe taking up as much room in a concentrate, and allow for good quality feed ingredients to go in as well, which can keep up the energy density of that ration. But I would say that the objective would be to feed the cow as well as possible. The 9 kilos, I suppose if it's short-lived, it's probably not the end of the world. I generally don't get too excited about concentrate feeding when cows are being in on silage. I think where the problem is if are you going to stay on the 9 kilos as soon as you go to grass, or how do you transition them back? Because you have to bear in mind that grass is quite a lush enough kind of product, and that could increase acidosis risk as well, I suppose, if you're feeding at very high levels. The other thing is 9 kgs is 50% of a cow's intake potentially, and that would suggest to me that at that level that you're not going to have enough fibre in the diet potentially to offset or to avoid any issues around that. So 9 kilos is a fairly hefty feeding rate. Now you can do it, but it needs to be managed, and it definitely can't be fed in 2 feeds in morning and evening milking. So people have to look at other ways, either through diet feeders going in through silage, or top dressing on feed outside, which you're going to need feed space in order to do that. So that's the end of the questions, I suppose. To summarize it, I think people need to have a quick, there's another question after coming in, sorry. What feeding regime would you recommend transitioning to grass? I suppose you're probably looking at, when I look back at what we used to be told when we were when I started out as an advisor with Teagasc, cows should be on 6 kilos plus good quality silage when indoors, and 3 to 4 kilos. I suppose 3 kilos works very well. Again, referring back to Mary McAvoy's study, they got very good production. There wasn't a huge amount of difference actually in production or performance or weight loss versus 3 kilos, between 3 kilos and grass, and 5 to 6 kilos and grass. So that would say that 3 kilos plus good quality grass is quite adequate for feeding to cows and generating high production. But I suppose that's in the best of grazing scenarios. I suppose in spite of all the rain that we've had, Moorpark have been in a position to graze fairly regularly. Ground conditions are quite good still, in spite of almost possibly record rainfall for the Cork area. Again, having looked at the Met-Éireann data late last week and what we've gotten in the early part of this week. So the 3 kilos at farm level, I'd probably say 4 kilos is probably something that people are probably more comfortable with. The 3 kilos can often be a bit of a push. And as I said, I'm not going to fight with somebody over a kilo either way here at this stage of the year. So I would say, to answer your question in terms of transitioning back, if you're going to grass, I would be starting to drop off probably by a kilo a day or so like that, to come back to 4 to 5 kilos if you're at grass full time. Probably stay on the 5 kilos probably if you're in on silage. But it's going to depend on the quality of the silage, I suppose. Depending on the grazing conditions as well, maybe sometimes there can be an argument for maybe trying to look after the cow as much as you can, or there is an argument. There's no argument. You always have to look after the cow as best as you can. So if you're out grazing, the day turns a bit poor, cows don't look like they've done a good job, they've walked a lot of the grass into the ground, then you probably put in a bit of silage and maybe give them a little bit of extra concentrate that night. But you're trying to get that balance right. This is where it is so tricky in the springtime, and can be tricky again, obviously, in the autumn time. Only difference in the autumn is you have a more stable intake to deal with. So in the springtime, you're dealing with fluctuation in indications or in intakes, and as a result, it can be tricky to get the balance right in terms of what you're feeding. So I think if you're on full-time grass, we've seen quite good performance on 3, 4, 5 kilos. And as I said, I'm not going to fight with people over a couple of kilos at this stage of the year. I think you probably can trick yourself into a false sense of security with the ration. I suppose an interesting figure that's out there is that for every kilo of ration that you feed over 3 to 4 kilos, it actually reduces grazing time by about 15 minutes. And for every kilo of silage that you feed over it's going to impact on grazing time by about half an hour. So I suppose where the trying to get that balance right is the challenge in my head for everybody, that you are feeding something in the yard and you're losing out on what you have outside that is for all intents and purposes actually a better feed than what you're feeding in the yard, if the conditions are good enough. So trying to get the balance right. So if cows, it's a bit like what Donald said. I think if you get cows that have cleaned out very well and they're almost after grazing their allocation in a very short space of time, you need to up the allocation of grass that they're getting then subsequently and see how do they do with that. So it's a bit of trial and error going on in it. And the feed situation can be a little bit the same as well. So you maybe, I suppose, no different to building them up, you need to take them back slightly, but you have to factor in that you're feeding them a far superior quality product when they do get to grass than either the ration or the silage that you're feeding inside, and that you have to allow for that as well. So you'll all see it, please God, in the next couple of days when you turn cows out, the tank will be fuller without a doubt. There's greater energy, cows will be happier, we'll all be happier, but you need to just ease back on the ration then to make sure that you still try to get your grazing residuals right as much as possible, without compromising the cow. That's, I suppose, ultimately is trying to get that balance right. So we want to try and achieve John Maher's targets in relation to grazing, but we also want to keep that cow going on that rising plane of nutrition that I spoke about earlier on, because we need those cows to go back and calve because of our seasonal calving system. So body condition score, in summary, we don't really talk about it a lot at this stage of the year in normal course of events because we have a lot of other things going on, but it was a good opportunity to talk about it today. So look at the herd as it currently stands, identify cows that maybe are under a little bit of pressure. I think they should go on once a day for the next month or so, possibly. That should, in many cases, correct a lot of their problems very quickly. As Sean McCardle said, I think it was, or maybe someone else, how long do you leave them on it? I think, and these early cows, they may not need to be on it as long as they would be if you delay doing this until much later in the lactation, because they won't have lost as much condition. So actually, from a financial what you're foregoing in terms of financial will possibly be less, and they don't need to be on it as long then if it's done early, because they'll have a greater time period. That period of calving to conception is greater for those earlier calvers, and then those later calvers, which we'll talk about again in another day, they will probably need to go on it for a longer period. All right. So I suppose just that's another question in. We'll quickly deal with it. Transitioning cows to grass, solving problems encountered in the early stages of the grazing season. Yeah, I suppose it's a fair point. I suppose I think I've talked to Joe about it recently enough, actually. So the question is, I suppose, cows running into trouble when they start to go to grass. I suppose the idea that you're just going to open the gate tomorrow morning and let cows out onto a full-time grass diet without having had some bit of a transition phase, I think might be a bit of a challenge for a cow. So I would say maybe ease them back in, graze by day for a couple of days. A bit like feeding ration. You don't feed them, slug them in 6 kilos from the day they calve, start them on a lower plane and start to rise them up then. So maybe something similar, graze by day for a couple of days, get them used to it. Hopefully conditions will allow them to go full time. If they do, they do. And if they don't, obviously continue with your good quality silage. And that should see the transition okay. Then the other thing that's critically important, as Joe pointed out a couple of weeks ago, is that transition period, and that 4 to 5 days after calving is very, very important to getting a cow to settle down, to get them back into the zone, I suppose, of milk production, and that they have every opportunity, so that they have plenty of headspace in that colostrum mob, as it's referred to in a lot of places, so that they can maximize their intake, which is going to be low in the first place, and that they're not going to be put under pressure by other cows that have big intakes, bursting into the barrier, eating what silage is in front of them, and leaving the cow that's freshly calved, who is a little bit more sore and timid, maybe coming to the barrier with a significantly reduced intake, further than what they would be if they had had good access to the feed. So I suppose look through the herd, identify the cows that maybe need to go on once a day, put them on once a day, sooner rather than later. So once a day, from just to clarify, just in case there's any confusion around it, they're still going through the parlour twice a day, they're still being fed twice a day, if they're being milked twice a day at the moment, and just milk them once a day instead then. And you should see an improvement in body condition in the next 3 to 4 weeks, and you can review it then at the start of April as to whether those cows need to continue on that regime, or whether they can actually go back to twice a day. So we'll leave it at that. I suppose just to apologise to people in terms of the content for the month of February was a little bit unknown, I suppose, to tuning in, and thanks for tuning in such good numbers. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be talking to people in ICBF in relation to bull selection, so maybe a little bit in the Gene Ireland programme I'm going to look at in the next couple of weeks. Dennis Howard from Munster Bovine is going to be talking to me as well in relation to the herd health programme that they're running, and what trends and results they've seen over the last number of years of that programme. And then next week, we're going to be talking to John Douglas in relation to grass targets, now that the whole situation has changed, probably given the month of February that we've had. So there'll be a bit more. I hope that gives you a bit more clarity in terms of what's coming up over the next couple of weeks. We look forward to seeing you again, and thanks for tuning in this morning, and everybody take care in the meantime.